the surrendering of justification and epistemology comes at a heavy price. And for the atheist, for the unbelieving secular type of person, for the positivist, for the materialist, etc., if they have that kind of an approach, if you go that route, you can't debate. Right. Debate is done.
Right.
In other words, you don't actually have any arguments against Christianity. I mean, you might not like it, you might not believe it,
right?
But you don't have arguments against it,
right?
Because now there's no such thing as argumentation. If there's no argumentation, then there's no debate, there's no logic, there's no reasons to believe or not to believe. So they don't, most of the time, philosophers are not consistent with the positions that they're adopting. Of course, the job of the apologist is to call those people to consistency. Hey, wait a minute, you said this, and then you're saying this. You got to be consistent with these two things, man. If you don't believe in epistemology anymore, if you're surrendering it, like Quine points out,
yep,
then that comes at a heavy cost, and you can't do debate anymore.
Yep. Yeah. So,
and by the way, I went, on that point of creating a kind of a perfect one-to-one correspondence math system, I think you had mentioned, Godel. This is where Godel comes in contra as an insight, contra Russell, because Godel points out that from math itself, you can show that there's no complete set. The set will always appeal outside of the set to something extra set.
Well, speak to that. Explain Godel's incompleteness theorem. And
right, and it's in response to that set building approach that you mentioned from
the Vienna School.
From Russell and these people, and he's pointing out. And by the way, there's I can't find these quotes anymore, but somebody had dug up some obscure quotes from Godel, pointing out that the Vienna School and people like Russell were actually part of a conspiracy.
Oh, really?
And he calls it a global conspiracy to not just destroy knowledge and philosophy, but he had apparently become aware of their plan for mass depop, right? Because we know Russell.
Oh, I didn't know about this.
Yeah, this is. I've never been able to find it again. It was some guys from a philosophy department that had found these old archives and papers from Godel.
That would be really nice to have, yeah.
And Husserl too. Husserl had mentioned the same, that he was on to this conspiracy.
Oof.
So some of these guys had noticed this and they couldn't believe it. And some people point out that Godel, towards the end of his life, got really paranoid and was scared. And he thought, because he had kind of realized that what these Royal Society goons were up to, like that they might come after him. So I wish I could find those quotes. I'll never be able to find them again. They were on some philosophy blog from 10 years ago. They look legitimate quotes. They weren't just like made up nonsense. This was from actual professors. So anyway, but the point is that, Godel had this insight, being a mathematician, that Russell is wrong on the way sets work, right, and that they become self-referencing. And so some people misunderstand me talking about this. They think that I'm saying that Godel was making a transcendental argument for God's existence. No, he wasn't doing that. But what he was showing was that the way mathematics and logical systems work is that they will appeal outside of themselves, right, and thus there cannot be any self-contained, perfectly consistent set, system, or theory. Another philosopher, sort of savant character, Douglas Hofstadter, wrote a famous Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, and he shows that in both Gödel's theorems and in the art of M.C. Escher and in the music of Bach, for example, you have the same, what he calls strange loops. And strange loops are, again, not just features of math and set theory, they're features of artworks. And so the repeating patterns that you see in Escher's famous works, repeating structures. I'm not a music person, so I don't really understand all of this, but the way that Bach's pieces can actually kind of be a never-ending loop. They're written in a certain way that they demonstrate the same principle of the strange loop, as he calls it. And the point is that it's just further demonstrating and proving Gödel's point that not just in math, but in many areas of life and the arts, we actually see this principle of self-referential strange loop.
Right.
I don't know what else to call it. And so that's an analogy to how I would understand circularity working,
Yes.
right? Again, think back to the Wittgenstein analogy. How are you going to, how do we know that words mean, right? I mean, surely that's a valid question. I mean, nobody can say, although some philosophers do, they're like, you can't ask that question, right?
Right.
They'll be arbitrary, like, you can't ask that question. Okay, well, why can't I, right? Well, usually people don't want you to ask the questions that they can't answer. So exactly. So if we ask this kind of meta level question, how do we know that words mean without using words, right? We can't, we're stuck.
Right.
We're not going to be able to give an account of words or explain words without using words, right? So the astute, annoying philosopher man might say, hey, wait a minute, as you're explaining words, you're using words, you're using the thing in question. It's a circular argument. And the point is that when we come to, and we could ask the same type of question about logic. We could say, how do we know logic is logical? That's a meta level question. That's a metalogical question. That's why there are metaphysical questions. There are meta ethical questions, right? How do we know that ethical norms are ethical? How do we, and there's nothing inherently wrong or false or stupid about these kinds of questions. It's not word salad. They're valid philosophical questions and disciplines. People write books about metalogic, metaethics.
Right.
A lot of ignorant people say, you're just making it up. It's word salad. It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. I'm sitting here reading a book right now on epistemology, and the guy's talking about meta level questions, right? And I recommend, by the way, if you're looking for a good, now he's not Orthodox, but he's a evangelical professor, I think at Wheaton, W.J. Wood. He has a good book on epistemology from at least a Christian evangelical perspective. Yeah. And the book is good because one thing he points out early on is that modern epistemology, because it's secular, it's actually dispensed with the idea of ethics having anything to do with epistemology. But now, wait a minute. And this is, you've heard me make this argument many times. I mean, people that listen to our material. I mean, if I'm making an argument to you and I'm wanting to persuade you, doesn't it kind of assume that you should follow what's true?
Right.
So how are we going to divorce ethics from the true?
Right.
Right. And thus, by extension, we can ask other questions. How are we going to divorce the true from the good? So we're immediately involved inferentially in the domain of metaphysics, even if we're talking about ethics.
Right.
And so his point is just simply that we've lost this holistic view of the fact that how can we really divorce epistemology from ethics, from the idea of what he calls the intellectual virtues, having integrity, having intellectual integrity, having intellectual honesty, being studious, right? Not being lazy. These are all things that used to be stressed in the domain of academia and being scholastic. I don't mean scholasticism, but being scholastic. Those are good things, right? And if we divorce those things from epistemology, then we start to get into the domain of epistemology turning into the thing that Wittgenstein is saying, right? Like philosophers are just like crazy people, right? Like, I mean, it's like, or I think maybe I may be wrong about this, but I'm just going from memory. It's been, again, probably 2006 since I had my Nietzsche class, but it seems like Nietzsche said something like, philosopher along the same lines as Wittgenstein. He says philosophers are like lawyers. Like they don't even really necessarily believe it. They're just arguing some case to convince you. And they don't even care if it's true or who knows if they even believe it. It's just a bunch of lawyering. So, I mean, you see that if we divorce ethics and the true and the good from epistemology, then we get these kinds of dilemmas where it's not about what's true anymore. And so we didn't really get into coherence theory tonight, but
I wanted to just quickly shift gears and just hit on a few topics real quick in regards to, you talk about Kuhn and the scientific revolution, talk about webs of belief, paradigms. This is all happening right around the same time that we have Godel, that we have Quine's criticisms. And so then just mention Kuhn, and if you want Popper and maybe his criticism, and then lay out, if we have time, get into coherency real quick. I know you're short on time. You got things you got to do, and I think you got another stream. But
maybe let me read this as a summary because it's worded really, really well. It might take a few minutes, but it's worth it because if you guys remember back to some of the topics that came up in the Trent debate, and then I later shared a couple pages from this book because he words it really well, and this will get us to coherence, and then we'll look a little bit into the insights of coherence theory and webs of beliefs, but why we're not necessarily going to say, oh, I adopt wholesale some secular epistemic theory of coherence. It's just insights that we got.
Exactly.
So in his book on epistemology, W.J. Wood points out about the problems in foundationalism. He says, being grounded in beliefs that are epistemically basic are described as kind of a starting point for strong foundationalists. Critics ask, however, should we think that only beliefs that are self-evident or indubitable or evident to the senses are properly basic? In other words, on what is the prior criteria by which we are saying this, and this are properly basic? Doesn't that kind of make the prior criteria more basic than the properly basic? And that will be the problem, you see, right? He says, true, any belief meeting one or more of these standards is an ideal candidate for proper basicality. But is it necessary that a basic belief meet these standards? Should this list of criteria be considered exhaustive? These criteria alone appear much too restrictive, for they fail to encompass many beliefs that we as humans have and hold without the benefit of argumentative support. Consider, for example, beliefs in one's senses, memory, consciousness. None of these beliefs are necessarily self-evident or indubitable or evident to the senses, and yet everybody, I think we would agree, has proper warrant or belief or that they are properly basic beliefs. In other words, it would seem odd you could go in the route, I guess, of doubting those things, but if we do, we end up in dilemmas of kind of destroying the possibility of knowledge.
Right.
Alvin Plantinga has argued that the criteria offered for identifying genuinely basic beliefs introduce a deeply self-destructive feature into the foundationalist account. If, as a foundationalist claims, only beliefs that are self-evident or indubitable or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic, then it behooves us to ask about the epistemic status of the basic belief itself, that only beliefs that are self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic. Is this belief itself self-evident? Mm-hmm. That's the question that you kind of posed earlier. Yep. And I like the fact that you hit on that because that's what Dr. Wood is hitting at in his book. And then he notes that strong foundationalism thus accepts a criteria that runs afoul of its own standards.
Right.
Yeah. And so when I brought that up in the Trent debate, you'll notice again that he kind of went circular there and said, well, it's properly basic because it's self-evident, and it's self-evident because it's properly basic, and we know that those are self-evident properly basic because they're the ones that are self-evident properly basic, right? I mean, that's the point here, is that this doesn't work. And so other problems he goes on to mention that often come up, like the myth of the given. And this is another big I think I brought it up in the Trent debate. I think I brought it up in the Stefan Molyneux debate, but this is just simply a question about what Sellers calls self-presenting states of one's perceptual consciousness, right? The idea that I seem to see a door, I seem to see red, whose job is to undergird all of our empirical knowledge. The belief that an epistemic regress can be halted in these self-authenticating nonverbal episodes of perceptual consciousness is what Sellers calls the myth of the given. The myth consists in thinking that perceptual states such as this thing is red and our powers of sensory discrimination in general are somehow pure and incorrigible, right, completely independent of any theoretical contribution or background beliefs, right, which is just simply to say that our experiences are not theory laden. Really?
Yeah, it's impossible.
How do you demonstrate this? What is the justification for the assumption that our basic beliefs or sense data is not theory laden? Right. And for a foundationalist account to work, that has to be the case.
Right.
And so, again, no one in that, there's not going to be a solution in that school to the myth of the given. Now, so when this is usually laid out, then people point out, well, then what's the other options? And there's a couple other options, and ultimately they both fail. But I want to mention a couple other things about what foundationalism typically is tied to, and that's called evidentialism. And evidentialism is the idea that, well, you kind of back up and demonstrate these beliefs that you have based on your properly basic belief, based on sufficient proof and evidence. And if you guys have heard enough of the debates that we've done, you've noticed how often this is just blown past and assumed, as if we have a clear idea as what, quote, proof is, or what sufficient proof is. These people never tell you what sufficient proof is. And it also makes, remember the Matt Dillahunty debate, because this came up with the Matt Dillahunty debate. Matt says you should only believe in things that you have sufficient empirical evidence to believe in. And I said, well, Matt, do you have sufficient empirical evidence to believe that?
Really?
And by extension, Matt in the debate admits that he believes in transcendental categories.
Yeah.
I said, Matt, what's the empirical evidence for transcendental categories? He said, there is no evidence. You can't prove those things. They just are. Okay, so Matt, so you don't believe that you have to have good empirical evidence to believe in things that you believe in.
So he's arbitrary in the way that
it is arbitrary, exactly. And so evidentialism is a really, again, naive addendum to the foundationalist approach to the thing, which is it just kind of assumes that evidence and, quote, proof are these vague kind of self-evident. We all know what proof is. We all know what's a sufficient proof. No, we don't. That's what's assumed here. In fact,